You're listening to the Australian Hunting and Beyond podcast with Matt, where we talk about hunting, shooting, fishing, camping, and everything else that the great outdoors has to offer. Let's get into it. All right. I've been excited for this one because I've been binging your YouTube channel, and tonight I've got Paul on the show. So, Paul, mate, WASP Files, can you give people a bit of your background and how you got into this? And I have a million questions, so welcome to the show.
Thank you. I came to the WASP Files from a relatively torturous route. Going back, I'm a filmmaker and a writer. And back in 2016, I was sort of shopping around for a project to do as a drama feature film, and happened upon the Port Arthur Massacre and thought no one's really done anything about this. So my initial intention in 2016 was to make a full-length drama feature film. And we were coming up on the 28th of April anniversary for that year. And I had to make a decision about whether I would announce my intention to make the film prior to the commemoration of that event. And I did decided to release a press kit, which just went viral, because I thought if I do it after the commemoration, the press will ignore it. But it just created a flurry of media attention. And there was a lot of criticism, of course, and I was interviewed on the project with our old friend Waleed Ali. But it gained a lot of traction and a lot of interest. And since then, I've spent 8 exhaustive years in investigating the Port Arthur Massacre in relation to wanting to make the film. And I wanted to dig deeper than most. So rather than just accept what I'd read online, I wanted to interview firsthand the people that were involved, the first responders, the police, the survivors, people that knew Martin, had grown up with him. So I dug deeply, and the more I dug, the more I went, this story doesn't add up. I'm a very scientifically minded person. I find the term conspiracy theorist repugnant. I don't consider myself that at all. I prefer to use the term alternate narrative and free thinker. I was always brought up to ask questions, particularly in the absence of information. And with Port Arthur, there was an absence of information. I found that all the hard facts that the media are so quick to proclaim were locked down, that I couldn't get access to these. So I continued on that process for many years, and I still fully intend to make my own feature-length film about the Port Arthur Massacre. But I felt that I needed to give something back to the supporters who really wanted to see a project on that very tricky topic matter come to fruition. And I was interviewed by somebody on a podcast about it many years later, and it gave me the idea to create the WASP Files so that I could at least help people, educate them about what they don't know about the Port Arthur Massacre and what the media certainly won't tell them. So here we are many years later, and the WASP Files has gained a lot of traction and momentum, and I believe I've ruffled some feathers.
Look, I don't doubt that. It's very interesting to sit back. I think the timing's perfect because we are seeing, with the rise of social media, we're seeing that a lot of things are coming out where it was hidden from the public, that the narrative is being changed. And, you know, that term you mentioned before, conspiracy theorists, gets thrown around. And it's quite funny because if you look back at the whole COVID situation, conspiracy theorist was thrown out, and now pretty much everything that they labeled as a conspiracy theory has been proven that it's actually correct. But the narrative and the mainstream media were really pushing that particular narrative, which is very fascinating. And it makes you question what else, if they could do that with sort of COVID, what else could they have done that with? And that's why I guess I came across your YouTube channel. It just popped up in my feed and I thought, oh, Port Arthur. I was young. I don't remember exactly what happened. I have heard that there was all these little discrepancies in what we were told. And so I thought, oh, I'll have a watch. And after the first couple of episodes, that's when I reached out to you and said, I want to have a chat because this is fantastic stuff because you've spent a lot of time and effort. Props to you on the quality of it and coming forward. And I haven't got through all of it yet, I'll be completely honest. But the ones that I have watched, and I've watched probably a good 15 or so, man, it just makes me question everything about the whole situation. It's insane. What has been some of the things, I guess, on this journey? Because actually, can we go back before this? When you started looking into this, did you have any idea how deep and sort of intertwined some of this stuff was going to be?
No, not at all. When I commenced my project, which was to make a film about Port Arthur, I pretty much knew what the mainstream narrative had projected to the world, which was that Martin Bryant had gone down to Port Arthur and shot up the tourist site and killed 35 men, women, and children and injured 28 others. And so I just wanted to do a biopic. And it was only after doing some deep diving and some exhaustive research that all of the questions, for which there were no answers, rose. And I was perplexed, firstly, and then quite astounded at the multitude of these. It wasn't just, a few oddities or anomalies. There was a plethora of discrepancies and even factually based witness statements that, in essence, stood in contradiction to the mainstream narrative. So it was astounding. And I sort of felt that it needed more questioning, and I was trying to get answers. So that's when I began that process. And I also found at that point that was when I was becoming aware that there was a very dedicated agenda to shutting down anybody questioning an event such as this. And I've often said that people often forget that this was, at the time, one of the biggest mass killings in the world by a lone gunman. And by law, it should have mandated a coronial inquest or a royal commission and certainly a trial, an open trial. And we had none of those. And that I found astounding and outrageous, that something of this magnitude, which you would think would be black and white, and that the answers would be there for all to see, and that there would be no question about the perpetrator's guilt, 100% beyond reasonable doubt in a court of law. And that was not the case. And that's why all these years later, as much as the media and the authorities want Port Arthur to go to ground and state arrest and be swept under a rug, it won't be, because there are far too many abandonment. There's far too much abandonment of the answers, and in my opinion, the truth. And the term conspiracy theory, we know that's a mechanism, or it's more ugly brother, which is tinfoil hat wearer. People are very quick to trot out that sort of catchphrase. Now, that was a mechanism that has been employed since the 1900s, but was particularly brought to the fore by the CIA in the 1960s, specifically to discredit anybody talking about the JFK assassination and questioning the Warren report. And now, as we know, 60 odd years later, new information is coming out which pretty much determines the conspiracy theorists got it right, that it was a government operation, an assassination of a president. So, yeah, conspiracy theorist, as far as I'm concerned, anyone that labels me with that, well, they can stick that where the sun don't shine. We are here to ask questions. We are here to hold our authorities to account. And we certainly should not be demonized for searching for the truth.
Oh, look, I completely agree. And I think that it makes sense to question a lot of things. And watching some of the episodes, some of the things that make me question are, I think the biggest ones are the witness accounts. And I know, I believe it was Wendy, who's recently passed away. You interviewed her, and she said she walked into the cafe and walked past someone who she said was not Martin Bryant. And she also spoke about another person who got shot in the neck. I can't remember his name off the top of my head. And as the gunman was walking around and he pretended to be dead, said that it was not Martin Bryant. That is very interesting that you have accounts from people who were there and they really didn't make the light of day up until your work here.
The gentleman you're referring to who was shot is a good friend of mine now. His name is Graham Collier. We catch up quite regularly. He's a remarkable, very observant, switched-on fellow. His loss was profound, as are some of the other people that I've befriended over the journey through the WASP Files, one of them being Stephen Howard, who lost his wife in the cafe, and yes, Wendy, who was a remarkable, tough, courageous, truthful woman who I interviewed. But Graham had tendered witness statements that he had watched the shooter enter the cafe because he was struck by his, what he termed a military bearing, though he had this kind of long blonde hair. He also said that he had noticed that there were two other individuals behind the blonde-haired male, and his impression was that they had come together. And he watched this person walk in and do a traverse of the cafe, and they separated from the other two gentlemen, came back in and were shooting. Graham courageously turned to try and save his loved ones, pushed them out of harm's way, turned back and took a bullet through the throat. It came out through the back of his neck and blew his teeth out, and he lay on the ground drowning in his own blood. His witness statement tended that the person who shot him was not Martin Bryant, but I had in-depth discussions with Graham, and he confirmed to me that the person who pulled the trigger was not Martin Bryant. I said, "Are you sure?" He said 100%. He described the shooter with a different complexion, a pockmarked, acne-scarred face, and what he, quote, said were workers' hands. So he is an incredible man, and he's never been called to give testimony in a court of law, as were any of the witnesses, because they shut down an open trial, nor has he been interviewed on shows such as the ABC's I Was Actually There. It was a hard-hitting documentary where they interviewed witnesses, but they cherry-picked them. So they ignored people like Wendy and Graham Skur, Jim Laycock, who knew Martin Bryant, and stated on the day that he believed the person was not Martin Bryant. So many of those people have never had their say, and I've given them their voice decades later on the WASP Files. And to me, it's an outrage that these people suffered the loss that they did, and they haven't had their say. They've never been given the chance to tell their story, and that's partly what I'm about, is I want to give people an opportunity to speak. So, yeah, there are many holes in the mainstream narrative from first-hand witnesses that were there, and they deserve their day in the sun.
Well, we're not going to be able to talk about all of it today because, there's so many discrepancies. And that's the concerning thing for me, is that uncovering some of these things and watching what you are showing has been an eye-opener, to say the least. But let's talk about a few of the different ones just to give people a bit of a glimpse into it. And I really encourage everybody to jump over to YouTube, look at the WASP Files, go through them, because it's fascinating, fascinating stuff. Let's talk about the gunman went into the cafe, and you talk about a camera that was taken in and accounts of that camera being taken in by that person, but that's gone missing and was never talked about.
That is one of many inconsistencies with the story and unanswered questions. So the whole argument pretty much is the identity of the shooter at the Port Arthur historic site, and then later on at the siege that took place at Seascape Cottage. So I spoke to the New South Wales forensics police, who, quote, crawled all over that cafe, in essence gathering crucial forensics evidence, which would be DNA, fingerprints on the food tray that the gunman had handled prior to the shooting, discarded shell casings, and an empty magazine from the firearm. And the idea was that they had contained the crime scene, which they hadn't, because it had remained uncontained and unsecured for 6 hours before the police arrived. But also there were reports that the gunman had gone into the Broad Arrow Cafe with a black video camera. And this was seen in a police training video that was later released when they were scanning across the aftermath of the cafe. And on the table where there was the food tray and the gun bag where the gunman had sat was a black video camera. So ostensibly, the notion is that the gunman had recorded the assault inside the Broad Arrow Cafe. This was also included in the film Nitram, which was a drama based on the Port Arthur massacre. And at the final scenes, they had the person portraying Martin walk into the cafe, sit down, have a meal, take out a video camera, press record, and then pick up the rifle and walk out of frame. That's all very interesting. And so I guess the notion was they could say, well, look, that proves that it was Martin because he filmed himself. There's only one problem. That tape has never seen the light of day. It was confirmed that a camera had been taken into the cafe by the police when they interviewed Martin Bryant, but it hasn't surfaced. It's never seen court. It's never been shown on any media to say, look, there we have video that is comprehensively Martin Bryant because he filmed himself. So where's the tape? And why hasn't it been shown? Why hasn't the ballistic evidence that I've talked about, the forensics and the DNA and fingerprints, which would comprehensively identify the shooter, ever been tendered in court? It's been locked down under the highest restrictive category with Chief Commissioner's eyes only for 75 years from the initial 30-year ban. We're talking 2091. So all this evidence that would comprehensively identify the shooter and to their to their I guess benefit, put all of this so-called conspiracy theory to rest, is if they release the hard evidence, but they won't, and that itself is suspect.
I personally think that speaks volumes, that 2091 is when it will be available. We liken things to, I look at what happened with COVID and Pfizer vaccines, and they've been shut down for another 75 years so that people can't see all the background information, which again is concerning. All these things are really, I guess it's the perfect time for a channel like yourself to get this out there, because I think more and more people are questioning mainstream narratives and going, I think not everything that we are getting shown as a public are accurate. And for me, there's so many discrepancies here, but let's talk about them. I don't know if you've done a video on this one yet because I haven't seen it, but it was something that was always raised with me, was there was a morgue bus or a bus for bodies that just happened to be purchased, and it was sold very quickly after. It happened to be in the local area to Port Arthur. There was just some really weird coincidences that were occurring with that. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, the infamous morgue truck is fairly well known amongst anyone that's questioned the Port Arthur massacre. It stands with a multitude of what we can term coincidences, which very fortuitously were in place prior to the Port Arthur massacre to enable, in essence, an authoritative response to the tragedy, to be able to control it. So one of these was the infamous morgue truck. Tasmania at the time in 1996 had very few deaths, certainly not of the scale of Victoria or New South Wales. And so there was some incredulity when the state government had ordered the commission and construction of a 22-person refrigerated morgue truck to be able to transport victims from emergencies in a refrigerated state to the local coroners. So this was constructed and basically used to great benefit immediately when Port Arthur had erupted on the scene. And it was the only truck of its time in Australia. New South Wales didn't have one, Victoria didn't have one, and so it was used. And then you would think, yes, okay, given the notion that Tasmania is its own kind of island, that a truck of that construction would be very valuable to maintain. But then it wasn't kept. It was sold by an ex Special Operations Group police officer by the name of Chris Wright, who advertised it for sale as the truck that was used at the Port Arthur massacre. and could be used in a movie recreation. So it was disposed of. I understand the truck was built by Ray Charlton, who was one of the local drivers for the funeral services down at Tasmania. But it was certainly there and put to good use on the day, along with a million other very fortuitous, coincidental, if you like, pre-organized situations which came into play when Port Arthur occurred.
Again, the word coincidence, it's just happens to be aligning, the stars aligning, and you do have to wonder, how did some of these things take place? What are some other ones that really have caught your eye over the investigation and creation of the WASP files?
Okay, some of the other ones, just to list them, were that the Hobart Hospital had just implemented a Code Brown. Code Brown was a protocol whereby a hospital could implement emergency protocols in the event of a mass trauma event that had literally just been put in place prior to Port Arthur. The other one was that there were the Port Arthur historic site had a managerial component to it, and in the 20 years since its operation, since the government had taken over the site, the managers had never been called away to take part in a conference, to discuss the operation of the site. However, they were instructed and directed to leave the site on that Sunday, Sunday the 28th of April, 1996, to attend a conference off-site about Port Arthur and to pack an overnight bag. So, coincidentally, and very luckily for them, they were off-site when the shooting occurred. This is the managers of the Port Arthur historic site. That was another coincidence. The other coincidences were, which were strange, were that Nelson Brothers in Melbourne had also commissioned the purchase of some mortuary refrigerated boxes. And there was a report by Stephen Parry, who was a senator at the time and also part of the funeral service, that he commended the Nelson brothers for the manufacture of these boxes ready for the incident, which people thought was an odd way of communicating that there was in essence, a pre-instruction to construct such a device. There is, of course, the famous quote by the New South Wales Premier Barry Unsworth, who was venting some frustrations at the inability for the states to come on board in unison with uniform gun laws in Australia. Apparently stormed out of the meeting and said there won't be any uniform gun laws in Australia until there is a massacre in Tasmania. Lo and behold, some months later there was. There was also conveniently a conference that was held in Hobart that had a number of trauma surgeons from all over Australia. And they were there attending a conference specifically on dealing with mass trauma and violent injuries caused by gunshot and so on. So there was quite a large number of trauma surgeons very handily on hand to be able to, in essence, treat any of the victims that came in from the shooting. There was also another conference in Hobart where there was 700 international journalists that had flown in from all over the world to have a big conference in Hobart. So when Port Arthur broke, there was no shortage of journalists available to attend the site. I could go on. There's just a multitude of very strange and very, very lucky coincidences that would have helped the management of such a major trauma. There were 200 emergency army blankets that somebody had delivered to the Port Arthur historic site, and they were kept there. There was no real determination as to who had ordered those and for what purpose. But then, of course, the blankets came to the fore to cover up some of the victims from the shooting. So the list goes on and on. There are many, many coincidences with Port Arthur, and a lot of people like to say with Port Arthur, there are no coincidences.
The probability of all those things you mentioned happening at the same time, wow. Like you just sort of sit there and go, the chances of all this occurring in this small period of history is very, very unique that that can occur. It's unbelievable to think of all this. I want to just get your thoughts on Martin Bryant a little bit because obviously the biggest sort of part of this is Martin Bryant as well, and there is so much discrepancy in him as a person and his abilities. I know that from my understanding that people have said that the way it was conducted was the shooter knew what they were doing, but that sort of contradicts Martin's own abilities, and I believe he was quite low IQ level and things like that.
Martin is a mystery, even all these decades later. There are many, of course, that will proclaim quite clearly, oh, in essence, that he is the poster boy for unintelligent, sadistic evil. His character is quite complex. I've once again dug very deeply and certainly spoken to a lot of inmates that have spent time with him in Risdon since his incarceration 29 years ago. I've got all of the psych reports as well. They're quite nebulous. You would think that there would be a clear determination on his mental capacity, but they seem to be contradictory in many ways. He is generally regarded to have an IQ of 66, which makes him equivalent to an 11-year-old child. And he certainly had mental issues or mental challenges, shall we say. He was antisocial in some ways, um, prone to antisocial behaviour, and had a lot of issues being ostracised, being bullied, being taunted, and so on. There are also some indications that he, although he owned firearms, that he was not proficient at all with firearms. There was an incident where a blonde-haired male, purportedly Martin Bryant, had entered a gun store and had a license, one of the new plastic laminated licenses, firearms licenses endorsed for both fully and semi-automatic weapons, fully being machine guns, under the name Martin Ryan. This person had brought in an AR-10 semi-automatic rifle, which is like a higher caliber version, very much of the AR-15. They had no operational familiarity with that firearm, brought it in wrapped in a towel, handed it to the gun dealer, said, "There's something wrong with this. I can't get it to work." And Terry Hills, who was the gun dealer at the time, was distressed to see that the magazine was fully loaded and that the rifle also had a round in the breech. It was locked and loaded. So this person didn't understand basic safety with a firearm by bringing a fully loaded and locked rifle into a gun store. So Terry had took the gun and said, "Look, I'll have to look at this sometime after Easter," and it was never returned. And so it was never used at Port Arthur, but Martin, by his own claims, that he didn't shoot much. He owned a Daewoo semi-automatic shotgun, which he apparently said he was sort of didn't fire because he was afraid of the noise and the recoil from the gun. This flies in direct contradiction with all of the witness reports about the shooter, who seemed to be a very proficient and very controlled, very, very well trained person who undertook the shooting that took place at the cafe. There's a lot of critics that say, look, it's easy to pull a trigger and they're all at close range. It's not as easy as that. Anyone who knows anything about firearms knows that it's even at close range, it's very difficult to be able to hit accurately. This person was shooting from the hip, and they were shooting from their right hand. Martin was known to be left-handed. So in a very short amount of time, the shooter who went into the Broad Arrow Cafe managed to kill 20 people in a matter of minutes, shooting from the hip. And a lot of these, the majority were headshots. So it is, and then from there was further shooting. The scale and magnitude of the shooting alone suggested somebody that could think on their feet, that had strong improvisational capacity, that was able to decoy the only two police away on a wild goose chase on fake drugs that were found on the other side of the island, to get them out of the picture before the shooting, commandeering vehicles, being able to avoid apprehension and people trying to wrestle the firearm away or distract the shooter. This was a person who was very calm, controlled, and there's also a psychological and physiological aspect with, particularly in a combat situation or a conflict situation with firearms. There's adrenaline, the emotion, the unpredictability, the panic of victims. And this flies in the face of Martin Bryant, who seemed to be not a very well-grounded individual, if you like, and certainly had a lot of disadvantages, both physically with eye-hand coordination and psychologically. There's a discrepancy, and you only have to go through all the evidence and read a lot of the witness statements to suggest that it's like there are two different people here.
Yeah, it's really fascinating to hear all this and sort of go on the journey of uncovering some of these things that you've found and how they're portrayed in your shows. And it's one that I didn't know a heap about it, I'll be honest. I knew that it occurred. I knew that there was some sort of discrepancies in bits and pieces, but watching what you have created and putting out there has opened my eyes up to what has actually occurred with the whole thing. And it's more detailed than I probably ever would have delved into just being a person that went, oh, yep, that occurred. Gun laws happened because of that. What has been the biggest shock to you, I guess, in reporting some of this and uncovering and investigating this?
Look, firstly, I didn't really want to be on this journey initially. It's a very grim and torturous journey. In many ways, I often describe that it's a thorn in my side. The thing that distresses me the most is not only that a lot of people that were directly affected by the massacre, and that includes the first responders and the police, who I have the highest respect for, but certainly a lot of the survivors who were adamant in calls for a coronial inquest. Because one major issue of these, which is in some ways associative but separate from the shooting itself, was that 7 people in the Broad Arrow Cafe directly lost their lives because a fire exit door on a government-controlled site was nailed shut. They couldn't get out, and they were just stuck at the fire exit door and gunned down mercilessly. And survivors like Wendy Skura and Stephen Howard, who were employees at the site, were sure that there would be a coronial inquest on that aspect alone to be able to determine the circumstances of not only why the shooting took place, but why a fundamental breach of work health safety laws occurred, where an emergency door was literally nailed shut. The government had tried to cover it up and say that the lock on the door was inoperable. But Wendy Skua, in her interview on the WASP Files, and has testified that one of her colleagues, her husband, had been responsible for nailing the door shut to prevent theft from the nearby gift shop in the cafe. So that is a huge breach alone. And the shock for me is that something of this scale alone, and also that attribute, and the calls for the people that lost loved ones, that were injured, were in essence ignored, that their rights were trampled on, that they weren't given the chance at all to speak in court, that Martin Bryant was never cross-examined. In the 29 years since he's been incarcerated, not one journalist has interviewed Martin Bryant, nor has anybody got access to the forensics and ballistics and DNA that would comprehensively identify the shooter. The media don't have access to that either. And as I've stated before, some of the first-hand crucial witnesses that contradict the mainstream story have never been interviewed. Now, that's an outrage as far as I'm concerned. It's not that anyone wants to glorify Martin Bryant. If Martin Bryant was the perpetrator, then by all means, historically release the information. He's been locked away. They'll never let him out. I very much doubt there will be a coronial inquest, though I am implementing some legal moves in relation to the legal processes, which also form an abandonment of due diligence in relation to Port Arthur. But if he is the guilty party, then there should be no reason why all of that information and that testimony should be heard, should be presented to the public. But of course, we know that the general rule of thumb is that we are told it's a need to know basis, and we don't need to know on many things, including COVID. They lock down this information. It's all about who controls the information, and the media works in lockstep with the government to just control what we are fed and what we are told, and woe betide anyone that has the courage to question events. They're just shut down, they're ridiculed, they're demonized, they're labeled, and this is Australia. You know, we're supposed to be the lucky country and transparency and accountability for our government, and that is certainly not the case. So that's what aggrieves me the most. If any of you out there think that we live in a free democracy, think again.
Yeah, that fascinates me in the sense that we are so, and I think it's getting worse now with algorithms and social media, and how much control the media can paint a picture or shut things down. And we have an e-safety commissioner who wants to shut down freedom of speech and putting things out there so that people can't have control over the information that they get, which is concerning because it's not always accurate and people make mistakes, whether it is planned or not. It's one thing that you really do have to think about. Okay, so super interesting, just so many things here. How did you, I know you sort of touched on how did you get involved, but I want to know what your position was prior to going through this. Were you always sitting there going that this doesn't make sense? Are you pro-gun? What's your positions and how have they changed over time after unpacking and learning more about this whole situation?
I've been a shooter for many years. I was 30 years old when Port Arthur had occurred, and as a result, as many of us found, we had to hand in various types of firearms, semi-automatic rifles and pump-action shotguns. I was, of course, pretty upset at this. And I guess looking at the notion of gun control, which is what we're talking about in relation to Port Arthur, it's often lauded that our then Prime Minister at the time, John Howard, took this courageous approach in forcing the states to get uniform gun laws in place and removing high-powered semi-automatic rifles, pump-action shotguns, and even semi-automatic 22 rifles from the civilian population. Of course, once you put the statistics into perspective, you find that in many ways the reaction to Port Arthur was I believe, not justified. And as shocking as it may seem to people who aren't shooters, there are reasons for that. Prior to 1996, gun homicides were on the decline. They weren't increasing. And generally speaking, if you look at the situation of firearm ownership in Australia, we know that there are now more guns in Australia than there were before Port Arthur, despite the gun buyback that the government had implemented. And that we don't have these mass shootings and gun crime to the hysterical degree that the media often proclaim. In fact, we have a very low gun rate of gun homicides. So I guess when you look at the statistics a little more deeply, you find that, for instance, in 2023, the homicide rate in Australia was around 247. And of that, 27 were gun related. And of that, the majority were criminals using illegal guns against other criminals. The media proclaim that there are 4 million registered guns in Australia, and an indeterminate number, but it has been mentioned that there are also perhaps something almost under 1 million unregistered illegal guns in Australia. So you go, wow, that's 5 million guns out of a population of 28 million. So the question has to be asked, why aren't we being shot in droves? Australians don't resort to gun violence to solve their issues. We don't have a gun problem. What we have is a media hysteria problem. We certainly have a government agenda to restrict and control the civilian population, and part of that agenda is civilian disarmament. We know it's factually accessible that the United Nations, as part of Agenda 31, which is their charter, if you like, for the next generation, is to have total civilian disarmament by 2031. And you think, well, that's a pretty big agenda to try and implement. So how would they go about doing that? So I guess I've always believed that, look, I common sense. I don't have a problem with um, putting in safety mechanisms and security mechanisms with firearms. By all means, lock them away in safes, keep them away from children, make sure you're licensed, that you're a fit, proper person. All of those common sense applications are fine. But banning firearms, with this hysterical cry to prevent the kind of climate that they often demonize the United States about, is an overreaction, a knee-jerk reaction, and it's a political bias. Um, I just think that Australians are different people, but also in America, once you look into the stats there, you'll find that 80% of gun homicide in America is due to African American gang violence. And that's the majority. Yes, they have their school shootings and mass shootings. And if we literally look a little deeper than just the aspect of the gun itself, and I've dug into a lot of these school shootings and mass shootings around the world, going back to Charles Whitten, the Texas Tower sniper who killed people from a tower in the 1960s, looking for the common denominator as to why these people, why innocent people, why somebody who's an 18-year-old kid would pick up a rifle and turn it on their peers or their schoolmates. And I believe I found the common denominators to that. So going back through history, the generality is that most of these people are young. They come from good homes, and that they have some slight issues, maybe a bit of anxiety or slight depression and so on. And what I discovered was that in 1988, prior to 1988, there were virtually no school shootings in America, no mass shootings. And what changed after 1988 was the prescription of antipsychotic and antidepressant medication went up 400%. Now, these drugs, if you know anything about them, are quite dangerous. They have very dangerous side effects, including the implementation of a reckless behavior and even initial suicidal and homicidal urges to the people to which they're prescribed to. So you get these kids that are a little bit mixed up, and rather than getting proper mental health support, they are fed these very dangerous drugs. They become isolated. They get lonely, and then that loneliness turns to anger. They have access to high-powered firearms, and then you've got a ticking time bomb. But not enough of a finger has been pointed at the pharmaceutical companies and the medical fraternity for the over-reliance on prescribing prescription medication. Port Arthur is not about gun control. It's about the lack of mental health support. It's about our porous borders. We know that criminals can, with impunity, get their hands on illegal firearms. That's where the focus needs to be directed, not towards law-abiding firearm owners who do the right things. There's also some catastrophic failures on the part of our authorities. In many of the shootings, particularly the recent one that took place in Queensland, I believe the question has to be asked, what was the managerial position to send inexperienced young constables to a rural property where they knew that the owners had firearms and were in some ways hostile towards police? Why were not the special operations group on point at that environment, that location? as opposed to sending inexperienced police officers into a potentially lethal situation and where they lost their lives. The other one was John Edwards, who was a person having a divorce proceeding with his wife, and he tried to join two pistol clubs in the New South Wales. And the way he was talking, they said, no, we're not going to give you membership because of your attitude towards your ex-partner. And you need to be a member of a pistol club to get a pistol license. And so he was denied entry. And then, of course, the New South Wales police issued him a pistol license, and he purchased pistols and went and killed his two children. So there are some questions, particularly also the one with Port Arthur was the origin of the Colt SP1 or AR-15 as it's known, where it came from. And the Herald Sun did an investigation and discovered that that firearm had been handed in Victoria in 1987 by a farmer by the name of Bill Drysdale in Yea, Victoria, under John Cain's ban following Hoddle Street and Queen Street. He was told that the firearm would be destroyed, but it wasn't. It was kept along with 17 other firearms that were confiscated or handed in by the Victorian Special Operations Group Police and used as their own firearms. They were illegally re-registered through the Licensing Regulation Division, and then they were sold to a gun dealer by the name of Garnet Featherstone of Granite Arms in Bendigo, who then on-sold them down to Tasmania. They have it on good authority that firearms that were handed in under gun bans in states went out the back door and straight down to Tasmania where they could be sold at the day. So the person responsible for putting the Colt SP1 AR-15 back on the street was not a law-abiding firearm owner, it was the police. So when you get failures of the authorities that are meant to control and manage the ownership and use of firearms, failing in that duty, which lead catastrophically to deaths, then you have some serious questions about who the fingers get pointed at.
It always makes me question how people believe some of the media sort of perspectives and that guns are dangerous because, as you just mentioned before, I think we've got 4 million registered guns here in Australia in a population of 28 million. If that was a problem, we'd know about it because that's a lot of firearms and a lot of people with access to firearms, and there isn't that issue. The issue with firearms is, the criminals, and by making guns harder to get or confiscating on different, like we've got appearance laws here in New South Wales, which I think are the dumbest things in the world. You sit there and question, how do we get to this stage? How have we got there? And I think we spoke previously before the podcast talking about Chicago being a perfect example. I think firearms are completely illegal in Chicago, and yet it has one of the worst homicide rates and shooting rates in America. And again, it's criminals, gangs shooting each other. It's not people that do the right things with them. And it's you wonder why the media don't actually portray this information accurately, and they cherry pick data or they hide things because it's unethical. And I just don't understand why, if they were not being instructed to, or what the gain is for it, or is it just sensationalism? Is it just to promote that fear-mongering of guns because that sells paper? Sometimes I don't know if that's the case or not.
Oh, it's there could be a number of answers to that. I would say that it's either part of an agenda or that they're gutless, that they just don't want to tackle the salient issues. It's too easy just to sort of point a finger and demonize firearms themselves or law-abiding firearms owners. I mean, I'm in Victoria, and New South Wales has its problems, but we are in a crime spree here. It is out of control. There's a lot of crime here that it's not being reported, including firearms crimes. We've got a bit of a gang war going on at the moment between Middle Eastern bikies and gangs that are shooting people in broad daylight with handguns and illegal weapons. And, somehow they didn't get the memo. And we also have an issue where we've got an out of control gang culture, and in their wisdom, the Victorian Labor government has banned machetes because these people are fighting with machetes in broad daylight in places like malls. And just the other day, machete wielding individual was shot by police. So, you know, the answer to some of the deeper sociological issues relating to violence in our society, the government's general reaction is to ban sharp sticks. It's just ridiculous. We also, victims in our country generally have no rights. We have less rights than the violent criminals that are operating with impunity. They know that our government, for instance, has just in the middle of a crime wave cut funding to the judiciary and the police. Now, I support the police, I always have, but they are trying to police with one arm tied behind their back. They are instructed, they are politicized not to target certain individuals because of, whatever agenda at the time, cultural agenda is appropriate. So we have out of control youths and gangs that are causing major level crimes, home invasions, carjackings, violent attacks with edged weaponry and firearms. And in many cases, that's a revolving door court. They're back on the street. Our jails are full. They just can't find a place to lock people up. And yet we're supposed to just sit in our house and go, comply. We're told, comply. If somebody literally kicks in your door, this is happening in the area where I live. We have people kicking in doors in home invasions with machetes and go and give me the keys to your Audi. And there is very little recompense. Of course, if you dare to try and defend yourself, particularly with a firearm, you will find yourself charged. And this is just, a disgusting situation. The two parties, we had a rash of young women that were murdered on our streets in Melbourne. And there was a common sense proposal put forward that women be allowed to carry pepper spray, a non-lethal means of self-defense. That was voted down by our so-called progressive proponents of government, the Greens and Labor. They wouldn't even allow women to carry pepper spray. We do have the right under law under 462A, a right of reasonable use of force in self-defense, but no viable means to do so. So we need a wake-up call. This needs to change. That doesn't mean that we need to be able to have firearms to protect ourselves in a castle war, but we need more rights for the victims. We need more focus on, in essence, stopping criminals. And also they need to be policed ruthlessly. And our media and government need to get on on a reality treadmill and understand what the real problem is instead of just taking the easy way out and demonizing shooters and firearms.
I completely agree with everything you just said there. I've got quite a few mates that are police officers, and I actually feel really sorry for them, is that especially the grunts on the ground, because they're not the ones making these decisions and policies and things like that. And I know so many of them disagree with a lot of the rules that they've got to enforce. And they get frustrated in catching bad guys, which is their job. And I think they do a pretty good job of it. But then they're back on the streets because the court system throws them out, or the mental health, we're going to let them go. There's so many options to it, which makes it very concerning. With all this that you've done, have you been concerned about retribution or blowback from authority because you're bringing up something that they don't really want out there in the current day and age?
Over the many years, I've certainly copped a lot of criticism, but I've also received death threats, multiple death threats. I've been unofficially warned off by ex-police and ADF members to leave it alone. Of course, it's all hearsay, but I'm very aware that there are eyes upon me in relation to Port Arthur, I have ruffled feathers. It was interesting to me that very recently, because the WASP Files has gained significant traction and momentum in a very short amount of time. I've only been running for about 6 months, and we're getting close to 2 million views and a lot of subscribers. Suddenly there was this big flurry in the media, and they just came out very quickly with some very vitriolic, demonizing posts about Martin Bryant being obese in prison, that he needs 3 mattresses to sleep on, and that new information, shocking information about his motivation had come to light, which was not that at all. It was old information, and it was spurious, unsubstantiated information. So, but it landed uh, at a very interesting time, because the episodes I'd released on the WASP Files at that exact time was a criticism of the way the media had handled the Port Arthur massacre. Um, in some cases, I could go into detail, but the episodes document the unlawful practice where they stole a photograph from inside of his house, and it was printed the next day on the main headline papers all over the world. Oh, this is the man and the face of a killer. Martin Bryant hadn't even been charged. I mean, that is illegal, and they were slapped across the wrist by the courts at the time. But that's not enough. Any chance of an unbiased and objective trial was prejudiced by the media taking it upon themselves to determine Martin Bryant's guilt before he'd even been charged. And then there was other incidences where they got his photograph and doctored it, raising the eyebrows and colouring his eyes to make him look crazed and wild. And this was brought up on Media Watch, where they discovered that the Australian newspaper had some glitch in the printing, which suddenly made Martin Bryant look like a madman. So yeah, there is a lot of, shall we say, agenda in essence to obstruct, delay, discredit, and in some cases lie about the events of Port Arthur and my attempts to get answers to the many unanswered questions. And you do have to ask why. That's only making me more suspicious. Why become so pointed in regards to shutting down any kind of questioning of Port Arthur? If it's as black and white as everybody makes out, then there shouldn't be any argument. But there is. There's plenty of argument and plenty of debate and plenty of controversy. And until they come clean, it will continue on, and I'll certainly be a party to that.
What now drives you to that? And the other thing I want to know is, you must get a heap of dead ends and brick walls with all this investigation. It must be a really difficult, time-consuming process.
It is, and it's very important for me to state that I'm not about money. Money's not my god. I've got many creative projects on the go, and I do all of these on the smell of an oily rag. I'm not interested in being a social influencer or popularity. I could give a shit about that. I don't care about that. For me, creatively, it's about the work. But as I said, I found myself on this journey, and I have to see it through. I don't quite know where it will end up. I would like to make a film that would, in essence, be an antidote to Nitram. Nitram was a great drama, and coincidentally, I had pitched my concept to Justin Kurzel, the director of Nitram, and to Stan, who made that film. And at the time, they said, no, we're not interested. And then they went and made Nitram, which, in my opinion, was cinema's way of brushing Port Arthur under the carpet. It was, very heavy drama, but I felt it was a bit underwhelming and totally inaccurate. The film was very inaccurate, pretty much just portrayed Martin for being this sadistic, crazed, nasty loner. They ignored the fact, for instance, that he was in love with a young woman that he was with 3 months before Port Arthur, called Petra Wilmot. She wasn't in the film. So, as to where it goes, I'm just going to continue on with this. My job is to educate all and sundry as to what they don't know about Port Arthur. And I will be creating one of the most comprehensive resource libraries on the topic that you can imagine. There is plenty of information out there that I've put up, but not all of it. There is a lot of stuff I've got that's never seen the light of day, and all of that's going to be freely available. I've just got to organise it, find the time to do it. But I do this on the smell of an oily rag. I've just implemented a buy me a coffee forum at the request of one of the partners of Graham Collier. or Graham Collier's partner, who suggested, look, you're doing this on your own coin. Ask people to help you. And that's been very heartening. But as a result of that, the profits go directly towards my friends who support the WASP Files and who are survivors from Port Arthur. So I do care, and I am about integrity, and I don't care about all the other stuff. It's just a journey I found myself on, and I'll just keep going, and I'm here for everyone else. I've also said too, I'm open to anyone. Anyone wants to debate with me, civilly reasoned, and have at me for any viewpoints I put forward. You're welcome. I welcome my detractors and my supporters, but I find, unfortunately, that 90% of the people that are detractors are nasty. They use profanity and just label, tinfoil hat wearers, and they're rude, and they just get blocked and deleted as a matter of principle. Because, debate civilly, reasonably. Don't just cast mud, behind your keyboard. That doesn't achieve anything. We're all here to try and find answers. That's what I'm about.
Well, I'm glad you are, and I'm glad you are doing what you're doing, because it was such a big event in Australia's history, and I don't think it has been portrayed accurately, and it was a catalyst to what we now have with our current gun laws and the reforms that took place. So I'm glad you are putting this information out there. As I said, I'm not completely all the way through, but I will be making sure I do watch all of them, because they have been unbelievably eye-opening, and I've learnt so much more about the actual what took place from what you are doing. So I thoroughly appreciate that, and I would absolutely love everybody that listens to the podcast, jump over onto YouTube, check out the WASP Files, watch it, learn a heap that you may or may not have already known. I can't wait to see where you go in the future with it, Paul, and what more information comes to the light of day for people like myself. And as always, if you can support him, please check out the Buy Me a Coffee and help him out. But, mate, I have thoroughly enjoyed talking to you. I know we could probably go on for hours, but I know you're a busy man, and so am I. So, mate, thank you for your time. Thank you for coming on the show. And, mate, I wish you all the best with it in the future. I'll put all the links in the notes and the show notes for people to access and go through, and I'll put it out on social media as well. Mate, keep doing what you're doing. It's fantastic. And, mate, thank you for coming on.
Pleasure. There'll be new episodes every Tuesday night, so I'll just keep going with this. Just a quick final one for everyone. One of my favourite sayings at the moment is, don't be the last man standing at Kabul airport. When everyone was trying to get out of the country when the Americans left it, and they were, oh, don't worry, the authorities will get the planes and get us out there, and they ended up clinging to the undercarriage of the planes and falling to their deaths. You cannot rely on your government. Do not ever trust your government or the authorities. Everybody needs to be able to be self-reliant and look after themselves if things go awry, because your government won't do it for you. So, yeah, stand strong, look after yourself, and be your own person.
I couldn't agree more. We see what's going on, and it doesn't matter what party's involved. I don't honestly think that they do the right thing by the citizens as much as they definitely could. So, all right, guys, I hope you've enjoyed this one. I know I have. Bye for now. You've been listening to the Australian Hunting and Beyond podcast with Matt. Thanks for tuning in, and can't wait to catch you next time. But in the meantime, if you want more, you can find it at linktr.ee/Australian Hunting and Beyond. That will give you our YouTube, Instagram, X, Facebook, you name it. We'll catch you next time.